And it's here that starting to think about how integrating different types of question can help. Angela's going to give some examples later of some of the challenges that we've seen when we apply some of those more traditional meta-analytic approaches, where individual studies just may struggle to cover all of the angles necessary, but also the number of different ways in which interventions and populations differ from one another, even in subtle ways, can often vastly exceed the number of studies that we've got available to inform our evidence synthesis. So traditional meta-analytic methods of subgroup analysis and meta-regression and the like are underpowered. We don't have sufficient evidence available just in the randomized trials literature, and we never will have. This isn't something which will be solved with more research. It's potentially the more research you add, the more noise essentially you get. We're not always able to just trust one particular type of evidence to be able to provide us with the answers that we're looking for. So what we're arguing here is that we need to synthesize different types of evidence to enable reviewers to include more of this evidence base. But we know that we're good at addressing questions of size and consistency of effect. We're less good at addressing these other questions about how and why we see variations in effect. So the challenge which is underlying the remainder of this presentation here is that combining different types of evidence is difficult, and it's something which you need to sort of think about and go into very carefully in terms of sort of like a methodological approach that you're going to take. But if we don't do it, then we are essentially failing to provide evidence that we need to for practical decision making. We can sit, if we like, in an area of high conventional epistemic security with pairwise meta-analysis or potentially network meta-analyses, takes few risks, but actually comes at a high cost if you're thinking about dealing with some of those complex social interactions, etc., that we might want to include in our analysis. So if we want to ignore all of that, then arguably what we might be saying was actually, in terms of face coverings, maybe the evidence base has got very little to add because we're not prepared to think about the types of evidence that actually might be useful in answering some of the more complicated questions that the socio-political dimensions might raise. We can't answer some of them with trials, for example. But if we are happy to integrate different types of evidence, then we're able to overcome some of those limitations in what we've called monomethod reviews. And what we're able to do is to lead to more useful and usable reviews. It's not always easy, but the outcomes that you see from doing it make the effort worthwhile. So I hope I've not sort of overcomplicated or overcomplexified the introduction there, Angela, but hopefully that's given us some of the sort of like the big picture as to why we might want to think about combining different types of evidence in an evidence synthesis.
That's great. Thank you, James. I think you've set the scene really well there. So I'm going to turn now to some practical examples of how we might start to do this, given that we're faced with intervention complexity in for nearly every review question that we're asking. So just to flag that this presentation builds on a number of other workshops we've been running over the years at Cochrane, trying to develop capacity for integrating qualitative with quantitative findings. So just a reminder, in case anybody here has not attended the webinars prior to this one, of what qualitative evidence synthesis is. So it's the process by which we bring together qualitative studies, primary studies which have addressed issues of context, process and experience. So some of the issues that James has alluded to. And it's a process where they can be brought together systematically and combined into a whole to produce new or enhanced understanding on the topic in question. So at the moment, what we tend to see is we have, on the one hand, lots of intervention effects review and increasingly lots of qualitative evidence syntheses, but with this huge gap between them. So they're not really speaking to each other. And what we want to get to is we want to try to get to the two sides to speak to each other, and to join them together, so we can for our particular review question, we can take answers from the intervention review and combined with answers from the qualitative evidence synthesis, so that we can produce a more complete answer for policymaker questions. So here's some recent guidance you can see here from the Cochrane Qualitative and Implementation Methods Group. So I'm going to be speaking particularly to a paper in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology, where we outline methods for integrating different types of evidence. But there's also a very useful paper looking at using or integrating different types of evidence for guidelines specifically, and so that's definitely also worth a look. And then we also have a chapter in the intervention handbook, and also to flag that we are working on our a qualitative evidence synthesis handbook, which will also update our guidance on integrating different types of evidence. So currently, opportunities for integration, but particularly in a Cochrane context, as we've got a library full of effectiveness reviews, and so what teams might choose to do is to conduct what we might call a post hoc qualitative evidence synthesis linked to a completed effectiveness review. Alternatively, it might be a new review where there's an opportunity to integrate a synthesis of qualitative evidence from the beginning with the effectiveness synthesis. And as I said, the main challenge in both cases are to get the different types of research to speak to each other. Many apologies, I'm just turning off my phone. So looking at different types of designs for integration, there's a useful paper published a few years ago, which went through a number of different types of designs for doing this kind of integration. And you can see there the first one there called data-based convergent synthesis. And in here, the important points are that all the different study types are integrated within a single synthesis. What I'm going to be concentrating mostly on today are what's called results-based convergent syntheses. So here we have qualitative evidence and quantitative evidence. They're both synthesized in their own terms. They're both standalone products, but they're integrated once the individual syntheses have been completed. We can also have a situation where there's no formal integration as such. There's separate syntheses of the qualitative and quantitative evidence, but the results are discussed in the discussion section of a review. So really today I'm talking about the results-based one, where there's actually an analytical approach, if you like, to integrating the two types of syntheses. We also have a second overall design, sequential syntheses, where you firstly conduct either a quantitative or a qualitative evidence syntheses, and the results of that inform your next synthesis. So you might, for example, conduct a qualitative evidence synthesis first, which might suggest several implications for how an intervention might work, which you may then go on to test in a quantitative synthesis. So when we were updating our guidance in the methods group, we had a look in our methodological register to see what kinds of methods and tools had been used for integration. And we identified at least 5 distinct types. which are all listed here on this slide. And what I should flag first of all is that these are not mutually exclusive, so you might use more than one in the same integration exercise. So some of them are very, very complementary. So on the left-hand side there is the use of a logic model or other type of conceptual framework. So this logic model or framework might capture how an intervention works. It may be informed by a priori theory. And those of you who have attended the workshop on framework synthesis, framework synthesis is a very good example of how you might use such a method to integrate. But the key thing here is the logic model or framework is used as a common scaffold which the different types of syntheses can feed into. The next method we identified was analysing program theories. So again, theories underlying how interventions are expected to work are surfaced, and this might be from a external stakeholder group. This might be done through the qualitative evidence syntheses, and then the quantitative data might be used to examine whether that theory actually works, and the qualitative evidence syntheses might then explain how the theory works in practice. So the juxtaposing findings in a matrix is more of a specific tool you can use in conjunction with analysing program theory or your logic models. And here you might have a set of themes that emerge from your qualitative evidence synthesis. And these themes might speak to barriers and facilitators to particular behaviours, which an intervention is trying to promote. And therefore you've got that kind of touch point from which to compare the findings from your intervention effectiveness review. So you might think about, for example, whether your intervention really addresses the things that people say are important from the qualitative evidence synthesis, and you may end up with identifying where things match, where there's gaps, and where there's mismatches. An extension to the matrix approach may then be to test some of your hypotheses from your qualitative evidence synthesis with effectiveness data. So your qualitative evidence synthesis may have generated hypotheses about how an intervention might work. So you could then use your effectiveness syntheses to group studies according to the presence or absence of the specification in the hypotheses. And then the last, qualitative comparative analysis, really takes this idea further and uses a particular methodology to identify the features important to a particular intervention. And then trials are used to examine which of these features are associated with the success or otherwise. So I'm going to talk you through some examples of each of these, of some of these different types of methods. And I'm going to start with a systematic review that myself and James were involved with a number of years ago. Okay, so this review was looking at community engagement itself, which is a contested term. It can mean lots of different types of things. But at the time this review was done, as it is today, there's lots of interest in community engagement, and particularly as a way of reducing inequalities in health. So this review was an example of that second opportunity I presented earlier, where from the start we knew that we wanted to include diverse types of evidence, that we would only really understand community engagement and its impact in inequalities in health if we looked at diverse types of evidence. So We had a systematic review addressing complex questions. We had a very good evidence base in terms of trials. We had 131 studies in a meta-analysis, so they were all synthesized separately. And, you know, they were good quality. Over half of them were classified as sound. But there was at least 200 possible covariates in terms of explaining the heterogeneity of effects. And there just wasn't enough research in terms of trials to be able to look at all these different combinations. So you can see there, for example, there's a range of different primary health issues targeted by the interventions. There was a range of different settings, intervention strategies, and so on, different types of comparison groups, different types of allocation methods, different people delivering the intervention, and many, many more differences between the studies. So we attempted to do an integrated synthesis. So we started off with theoretical perspectives from the literature, from our review team and its advisors. We had descriptions of interventions. We had qualitative data on intervention processes. And then we had our intervention outcomes, and we also had health economic data. But just focusing in on the qualitative bits there, we had our theory of change, and we put that into an analytical model so we could compare that with the meta-analysis. And basically what we were able to do was to explore variation in intervention effects in a very theoretically grounded way, so grounded in the perspectives of the people involved in these interventions, and also people involved in experts in community engagement. And this was our conceptual framework there, which we used as that common scaffold to integrate the different types of evidence. So you'll see there we had the conditions for community engagement when it worked well, and its context, as well as some of the outcomes there in terms of empowerment, self-esteem, etc. So this review not only used a conceptual framework, but it developed specific theories of change as well. So one of the things we looked at in terms of the interventions was we had three main types of theories as to how community engagement worked. And key to that is highlighted in the red boxes here. So around peer delivery of the intervention, the community being mobilized into action, and the views of the community are sought. And you can see there each of them has a slightly different theory of change, which we were able to test then through the meta-analysis. So another example of analysing programme theory linked to a Cochrane review, so a Cochrane effects review in the Cochrane Library, which is focused on school feeding. An example of this might have been a nutritional supplement. Then there was a companion realist review undertaken to understand the variation in the effects of these interventions. And they undertook a realist review, which some of you may be familiar with. So this example of juxtaposing findings in the matrix is really a very old but very classic example now of how you might start to integrate. So on the left-hand side of this table are the results from a synthesis of qualitative research on children's perspectives. And in this case, it's about the promotion of fruit and vegetables, so getting children to eat more fruit and veg. And our qualitative evidence synthesis led to recommendations for intervention. So these are like theories of how interventions should work. So you can see there about not promoting fruit and vegetables in the same way, branding them as an exciting experience, not just a healthy one, so reducing the health emphasis in messages. And so then looking at the trials, we looked to see whether some of these recommendations had been taken up or tested in the interventions. And you can see there that the way this enabled us to highlight gaps. So none of the interventions had tried to promote fruit and veg in the same way. But where we had trials which had, for example, branded fruit and vegetables as exciting, and we also had trials that had either not reduced health emphasis in messages, or those which had attempted to do that. So that led us on then to the next tool, to testing the hypotheses generated through QES using subgroup analysis. And you can see there in this example, we can see that those interventions that had little or no emphasis on health messages had higher effect sizes. And this is quite often repeated over a number of reviews, where we see that where intervention developers have paid attention to the lived experiences of those that they're trying to target, the interventions are often much more effective. So with qualitative comparative analysis, this takes this idea a step further. And in this particular review, which was looking at weight management programs, so what are the successful features of weight management programs, a qualitative evidence synthesis has been done on provider and participant views of what makes a successful weight management program, and a number of I suppose features were identified, which you can see across the top of that table. So the direct provision of exercise, the quality of the provider relationships, and particularly providers working in alliance with the participants in the weight management program, having a graduated exit, so participants had were taught to kind of self-regulate, so the regulation shifted from the provider to the participant, and also the intensity of the intervention. So you can see this is a typical table provided in a QCA to analyze which features are present and which features are absent, and you can see from this that for example, provider relationship seems to be a necessary condition for effective interventions. So it's present in most effective interventions, but it's not present in only present in some of the least effective interventions. But it's not sufficient. This needed to be combined with graduated exit, so a type of self-regulation, and the provision of exercise. So this kind of QCA analysis enables the review authors to identify those intervention components that lead to high effectiveness or least effectiveness. So in our weight management example there, you can see there's two pathways to the most effective interventions, both with provider relationship, one with direct provision of exercise and one with plus the high intensity and graduated exit. So this has an advance on the kind of statistical subgroup analysis, because you're able to look at multiple different pathways. So QCA has been used in a review in the Cochrane Library to look at school-based self-management interventions for asthma. So that's the reference there if you want to go and have a look at that in a bit more detail. So in terms of choosing between these different methods and tools for integration, as I said, some are much more advanced than others, and all have their strengths and weaknesses. So for example, using an a priori conceptual framework, such as a logic model, Some of its limitations may mean that you may squeeze the data into the framework. You may not have the qualitative and quantitative that exist to populate that framework. You may be reliant on one source over the other. The analyzing program theory. For some types of program theory, for example, realist review, you need to have that expertise in realist evaluation. Whereas a more simpler approach, like the matrix approach, doesn't require specialist skills or software, but it does mean that you can only examine these intervention characteristics one by one. So the QCA, the qualitative comparative analysis, has that advantage, is able to examine multiple features across different contexts, but it does require this specific expertise in QCA. So in terms of a set of appraisal questions for integration, you might want to first of all ask which approach is used and whether that was appropriate. Identifying the method or tool in each review to integrate the qualitative and quantitative evidence. How appropriate was that? How explicit or systematic was the procedure? I think a key challenge for these types of integration is, because the methodology can be quite complex, is how we communicate that in terms of how the steps have been taken, and how transparent is that in keeping with the transparency principle of systematic reviews. Might want to appraise the integration in terms of how useful the findings are. So has it allowed different perspectives to be included in the review, as opposed to just always relying on the expertise of trialists, the expertise of providers of interventions? Has it allowed the perspectives of those targeted by interventions to have a stake in the review findings? And then the ultimate test is about usability. Do your users find the product of the review more useful than if you'd simply presented them with an effectiveness review or a qualitative evidence synthesis?